Number 1.
This is the scariest episode from my childhood. It took place in 1991, when I was 8 years old. I lived in a village on the Norwegian countryside, with my parents and 2 older brothers. There weren't many kids around for us to play with, so we always stuck together, despite the age difference. I was 8, my brothers 10 and 12. It was a safe neighborhood and we were really outdoorsy kids. It was fine for us just to return home and eat, and then go back out again and play in the woods or go fishing in the nearby lake. In autumn of 1991, my oldest brother dared us to sneak through the hedge to the abandoned property that was located close by. We had always thought of it as a haunted house, but really it was just an old house where the man who started the village brick factory once lived. No one had lived there for ages, and the paint was starting to peel off, and several of the windows were broken. Our parents would tell us never to go there. Their reason was, of course, they feared that we would get hurt playing there, but we thought it was because it was haunted. But that day we dared to walk around in the garden, and now had a dried up pond, an old well, and several old and dying fruit trees, and even tools in the old shed. It looked as if someone had just walked out one day and never returned, leaving everything as it was. We soon came to think of the garden as ours, and played there all the time. We climbed the trees, used the tools to build things. It was great, our very own secret playground. We suspected that people in the village had seen us, because soon our parents would ask us if we had gone there, despite it being strictly forbidden, which of course we denied, but someone must have complained. We were rather loud and untamed kids. Until one day in November. I remember since it was in the days before my birthday. It was a damp and rainy day, and we weren't really in the mood to play outside. But our mom had chased us out of the house, so she could clean in peace, and we weren't allowed back until an hour later. So we decided to try and open the old cellar. I'm not sure what the word is in English for this kind of cellar, but imagine, if you will, a hatch that opens almost horizontally to the ground, then a few steps that leads you down to a dugout cellar, with stone walls and a dirt floor. It was used to store vegetables and such, but it was empty now. All of us climbed down to have a look. The plan was to write our names in the inside of the cellar, as if to mark it as our own. Suddenly the hatch slammed shut above us, and the cellar became completely dark. I started screaming, and my older brothers tried to open the hatch. When my oldest brother, Sindri, pushed the hatch open, he saw a man's hand holding a small axe.
"Come on out, trespassing little brats,"
the voice growled, the axe close to the opening of the hatch. "Hell no," Sindri shouted back and slammed the hatch shut from the inside.
"All right, little brats. I know you're in there, all 3 of you little shits. Does your mommy know you're in there? Well, does she? I bet she doesn't. No one will look for you."
We heard him dropping the axe and start to move around with something else. Soon we realized that he had taken out a hammer, and before we knew it, he started to nail shut the hatch. I threw myself at the hatch, determined to get out, but the moment the hatch opened just a tiny bit, he reached for the axe again.
"Come on now, come on out. It's the better choice, really. It must be awfully dark and damp in there. Aren't you afraid of the dark? Go on, let your little brother out." Let him out.
He laughed, and we could all hear that he was drunk. My older brother Emil was pleading with the man to let us go, promising that we would never return, but his words fell on deaf ears. The rain had started to fall really heavily now, and we heard thunder outside. The drunk man with the hammer was cursing and moving around outside, clearly bothered by the bad weather.
"I might come back to let you out one day, or maybe I'll butcher all 3 of you,"
he whispered through the wooden door as he hammered the hatch shut. We were too terrified to do anything, but Sindri told us to keep calm and it would be okay, as he surely was just out to scare us. The dark was compact inside the cellar, and it was cold and damp. After a long while of silence from the man outside, we started to wonder if he had left. Sindri decided that we should count to 100 and then try to get out. We counted loudly and then used our hands to find the hatch. It was definitely nailed shut. Sindri then told us to feel around the stone walls for a loose stone, and we did, cutting our palms upon the sharp edges. Eventually we did find one, and it was surprisingly easy to remove from its place. The cellar was old and had not been tended to for ages, and the rainy climate of the Norwegian coast had left the wooden hatch doors rather soft with age. The cellar was built in such a way that it was almost impossible to get a good forward motion in order to break the wood, but fueled by panic and adrenaline, we broke the lower half open. Being closest to the ground, it was softer and easier to tear apart. We started digging with our hands, creating a small opening out. Being the smallest, my brothers pushed me out of the cellar, and I could see that the man was in fact gone. My brothers were too big to fit in the small opening, and Sindri said I would have to get the hammer and get the hatch open. I was absolutely petrified that the man would come back with the axe, and I would have to run, leaving my brothers to die, or stay and be slaughtered. At 8 years old, I had no doubt that that would have happened. I got the hammer, but I couldn't get the nails out, so I used the hammer to simply break the hatch into pieces. Soon we were all three running for dear life across the garden and to our house, where Mom threw a fit over the state of our clothes and hands and demanded to know what we have been up to. Nothing, we all lied, unsure of what to say. We never went back there again. We never even looked that way. The man with the axe? I have no idea who he was or where he came from. I wonder if he was just a drifter living in the abandoned house, not wanting noisy kids to disturb the peace. We never told anyone about it. But every year, when Sindri, Emil, and I reunite at the family home for Christmas, we always ask if there's any news about the old ghost house down the street, and has anyone moved in there yet.
Number 2.
This happened to me just over a week ago. I was driving north from DC to Massachusetts to visit my sister who had just had her first baby. It was about 9 p.m. when I crossed over the Delaware Bridge and made my way onto the New Jersey Turnpike. I was listening to NPR and sipping on an energy drink, traveling about 65 or 70 miles per hour in my rented Tucson when my cell phone started to ring. I've been pulled over and ticketed for driving while on my phone before, so I pulled my car over to the side of the road. I was about 13 miles north of the bridge, and directly to my right where I had pulled over was a warehouse of some kind, with a parking lot behind a chain-link fence. The property even had its own overpass extending over the road, so people traveling in the southbound lane could access it. I parked my car on the shoulder of the road and answered my phone, which turned out to be my mother, just checking up on my progress. She had already flown in from Florida to be with my sister during the birth, as well as to escape from Hurricane Irma. We spoke on the phone for perhaps 2 minutes before I told her that I would see her soon, and we hung up. I was about to put the car in drive and continue on my way when I caught something out of the corner of my eye to the right. Standing in the darkness directly on the other side of the chain-link fence was a man who appeared to be wearing a gas mask, staring right back at me. I squinted hard as I peered back at him through the darkness. There was some illumination from the overhead streetlights, and of course, there were the headlights from other cars, but I couldn't get a clear view of him. For the first several seconds, I was convinced that I was just hallucinating, because there was no way anyone could be wearing an old-fashioned World War II style gas mask in a parking lot late at night just staring at people in this day and age. After what felt like 30 seconds, I concluded that it had to be a prank. A pretty creepy one too. The guy had barely moved since I made eye contact with him. I cracked a smirk and waved towards him, but he seemed fully dedicated to the performance because he didn't acknowledge the wave. I started to chuckle and glanced down to pick up my phone back up off the passenger seat, intending to take a video of him. But when I raised my head and aimed the phone towards the fence, my heart literally skipped a beat as I saw the figure stomping across the grass right towards me, having apparently walked directly through the fence. I screamed as the figure raised something above his head. I'm not sure what it was, perhaps it was a pipe or a crowbar, but I didn't wait to find out. I put my car in drive and floored it out of there, speeding down the turnpike at almost 90 miles an hour. I didn't look behind me, I just kept driving flat out for about 2 minutes before I slowed back down to about 60 and tried to collect myself. I knew there hadn't been a gate at that part of the fence because I had been staring at it for a better part of a minute. Had there been a gate, I wouldn't have hung around. But what the hell just happened? If it was a ghost or something, it hadn't been transparent. It looked completely real. I pulled off the turnpike at the next rest stop and sat in my car, trying to make sense of it all. If it had been a prank, some kind of Chris Angel illusion, it had been amazing. But what really bothered me the most was I had taken my eyes off the figure for perhaps 3 seconds tops, just to pick up my phone and raise it. How had the figure in the mask known to move right when my eyes were averted? Could it really see me that well through the dark in a mask? And what were its intentions once it reached my car? I sat in silence in the car until my pulse returned to normal. I shook it off as best as I could and continued on my way. Needless to say, I never got a video. I never called the cops, or did any kind of investigating into the building or its history. Tomorrow night, I start driving back to DC, though I've decided to take a different route home. If you want to check out the building, feel free. Just don't blame me when you get arrested for trespassing, or attacked by a gas mask wearing maniac.
Number 3.
I'm not going to share my name, age, or location. I'm not writing this to entertain you. I'm writing this because I want to know if anyone else has experienced this, and if so, what can I do to stop it? I live in a gated apartment complex where the buildings form a square around an inner courtyard. Inside the courtyard is a grassy lawn area with a playground for kids and picnic tables. About 2 years ago, I was sleeping peacefully one night when a bone-chilling scream started coming from somewhere outside from within the courtyard. It was a tortured scream, like someone was being burned alive. But honestly, my ears were ringing so badly, and my adrenaline was pumping so hard. That was just an educated guess. The screaming was almost non-stop, with barely detectable pauses where the person took a breath. I heard people from all around the apartment building stepping out onto their balconies, trying to figure out what was going on. I went to my window and glanced outside. There was no lights on in the courtyard, but at least one tenant was shining a flashlight down from a window above, trying to find the source of the screaming. Each building is 3 stories tall, and I live on the ground floor apartment directly across from the mailboxes and the entrance. So if and when the police arrived, I would be the first to encounter them when they made their way out to the courtyard. I left the window and ran down my hallway to the front door and looked out my peephole. I could hear the screaming, and it was making my blood freeze. It almost sounded like it had an echo behind it, like it was reverberating off the stone walls of a deep pit or a stone tunnel. But regardless, the ferocity behind it was the most terrifying thing about it. It sounded like some poor guy was having his limbs torn off. I waited by the door for perhaps 5 minutes. There was no signs of police sirens, and the screams never let up. From elsewhere in the apartment complex, I heard children crying and people yelling. One guy was screaming profanities, and I heard at least 2 other people down in the courtyard yelling. There was no way I was leaving the safety of my apartment. I stayed right where I was, waiting for the cops to arrive. Then suddenly the tone of the screaming changed. Something was happening. It started moving towards me. Whoever or whatever was wailing from outside was leaving the courtyard and heading in my direction. I felt my heart sink as the screaming grew louder, until it was echoing off the walls from the hallway outside my door. I pressed my hands over my ears and slid down the door, closing my eyes and praying for the screaming to stop. It was so loud, I felt the noise in my bones, like it was shaking my teeth. There came a frantic pounding at my door and I screamed, too terrified to stand up and glance through the peephole, afraid of what I might see. Then as soon as it started, it was over. I lay on my hallway floor sobbing, and my head was ringing from the noise. A crowd of people had gathered outside my door and were shouting at each other, demanding to know what had been going on. The police arrived about 5 minutes later, and after they had settled down the angry mob outside my door, there came a knock. Apparently, most of the other tenants assumed that either myself or somebody I knew was responsible. As the screaming had stopped right outside my door, I let the police search my apartment to prove to them that I wasn't hiding anyone. Then they took my statement. The courtyard was searched, and the security cameras were reviewed, but there wasn't any footage that showed anyone either leaving or entering. This has happened 5 more times since then, what I call the phantom screaming. There's no pattern as far as I could tell. There's no way to predict it. It starts in the dead of night, continues for several minutes, and always ends up right outside my door before it stops. Most of my neighbors blame me for it and hate me, because they're convinced that there's some connection between the screaming and it always ending at my door. They claim that I've traumatized their children, and have tried to get me evicted twice, but no concrete proof has ever come to light that I'm the one to blame. I've never tried to record the screaming, though I know plenty of other tenants have. Once, a man marched out into the courtyard when the screaming started and fired 3 shots from a handgun into the air, which didn't solve the problem and resulted in him being arrested. The first few times I was willing to write this off as a horrific joke, but after 6 times I concede. I believe it to be something paranormal, but not once has anyone ever spotted a figure entering the courtyard, even though security has been tightened. So, does anybody know what's going on? Does this thing want me, or connected somehow to my apartment? What do I do to fix it? Can I fix it? If anyone has any solutions, let me know. Even when the screaming isn't happening, I still lie awake at night sometimes in a cold sweat, because I can hear the tortured wails echoing in my head. Some of you may ask, why don't I ever look through the peephole? Well, I refuse to do that. In fact, I've covered the peephole with duct tape. I'm terrified at the notion of looking at this thing, whatever it is, directly in the eye.
There's always a reason to be afraid.